the Old Testament kind of leaves us with this expectation of a coming shepherd. And we spent a good portion of last week additionally exploring the shepherd-sheep relationship in order to kind of prepare our minds, or try to help our minds understand this first century nomadic mindset of a shepherd-sheep relationship. Remember, we saw that the shepherd's life was one of hardship and of danger. The shepherd led his flock into the countrysides, and he was exposed to the seasons, to the weather, to the heat and the cold, as well as exposing himself and the sheep that which he guarded to the wolves and to the other beasts of the field who were determined to eat the sheep. The shepherd also carried with him his mantle or a fleece, his food, and a staff by which he guarded the sheep. He guided the sheep, and again, one of his jobs was to take the sheep from the fold, lead them into the pastures, bring them back to the fold. And one of the things I forgot to say last week was, as he brought him back into the fold, the sheep would go underneath his staff into the shepherd's fold, and he would count them, and he would check them to make sure they were healthy and had no ailments. Now, there's two types of folds that might be used here in John 10 when we get there. One is more of a temporary fold. If the shepherd didn't get back to town with his flock that night, he would go build a temporary shelter, usher his sheep in, and then he would sit in the doorway of the shepherd fold, or the sheepfold that he had placed. If he was able to get back to his main town, he would bring it back to the town's fold of sheep, and he would put the sheep in, and he would hire someone to sit in the door while he would go and sleep and take rest. And this hireling would be watching the sheep through the night, and that fold would contain many flocks of sheep from many different shepherds. So we'll see both of these scenarios used in John chapter 10. The shepherd-sheep relationship we looked at, we discovered a few elements that were supported by Scripture. One, we saw that God is the great shepherd. We saw, two, that Israel is the flock of God in the Old Testament. And in the New Testament, the apostles extend that to the church. So we are the flock of God. We see that number 3, God leads and guides his flock. Number 4, that God provides for his flock. 5, that God protects his flock. 6, that God seeks out and saves or rescues those sheep who wander astray. 7, we see that God judges his flock. 8, we saw that God promised to gather his flock into one fold and under one shepherd. And finally, we saw that 9, God appoints under-shepherds to care for his flock. Now, this was in order to kind of lead us up to John chapter 10. But I realized that we really haven't set the context of John chapter 10. And the reason this is important has become very clear to me in the last few weeks. I was in a youth meeting, I guess you could want to say, where the guy was speaking, the speaker was speaking to teens, and he went to John chapter 10, verse 10, the context that we're going to be in, which reads, "The thief cometh not, but for to steal, to kill, and to destroy. I am to come that he might have life, and that they might have it more abundantly." After he read the verse, he puts his Bible aside, never to touch it again, and he plays what is called Let's Make a Deal with the Teens. After a few minutes of that, he crosses out the word deal and puts decision. Let's make a decision. And here's how he interpreted this passage. He said that you should choose tonight Jesus or Satan, because Jesus wants to give you a great life here and now. He wants to give you life more abundantly. Satan wants to come and steal your joy. He wants to come and kill your dreams, and he wants to destroy your purpose or your vision for your life, or your destiny, I think he said. Now, is that a correct interpretation of John 10:10? No. Is it theologically accurate? No. The reason he was able to do that with this passage is because he pulled it out of the context, used it in whatever way he wanted to, and ended up teaching these kids false doctrine. Now, it's just recently. The purpose that I tell the teens when I teach them, the 3 main rules of proper biblical interpretation is context, 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 because it is a safeguard against poor interpretation. So, that being said, I want to go to John chapter 9. And I want to read, and we're going to start in verse 24, because this is the scenario in which Jesus is talking in chapter 10. And then again they called the man that was blind and said unto him, Give God the praise. We know that this man is a sinner. He's speaking of Jesus. The blind man answered and said, Whether he be a sinner or no, I know not. One thing I know that, whereas I was blind, now I see. Then said they unto him again, What did he to thee? How opened he thine eyes? He answered them, I have told you already, and you did not hear. Wherefore would you hear it again? Will you also be his disciples? Then they reviled him and said, Thou art his disciple, we are Moses' disciples. We know that God spake unto Moses. As for this fellow, we know not from whence he came. The man answered and said unto them, Why herein is the marvelous thing that ye know not from whence he is, and yet he hath opened my eyes. Now we know that God heareth not sinners, but if any man be a worshipper of God, and doeth his will, him he heareth. Since the world began, was it not heard that any man opened the eyes of one that was born blind? If this man were not of God, he could do nothing. They answered and said unto him, Thou wast altogether born in sins, and dost thou teach us? And they cast him out of the synagogue. Jesus heard that they had cast him out, and when he had found him, said unto him, Dost thou believe on the Son of God? He answered and said, Who is he, Lord, that I might believe on him? And Jesus said unto him, Thou hast both seen him, and it is he that talketh with thee. And he said, Lord, I believe. And he worshipped him. And Jesus said, For judgment I am come into this world, that they which may see not might see, and they that which see might be made blind. And some of the Pharisees which were with him heard these words, and said unto him, Are we blind also? And Jesus said unto them, If ye were blind, ye should have no sin. But now ye say, We see, therefore your sin remaineth. Now this is the immediate context. Look at verse 1 of chapter 10. Verily, verily, I say unto you. Jesus immediately starts into a metaphor. So we're going to study a little bit of John chapter 9 tonight. But before we do that, let's pray. Lord, we thank you for this day. We thank you for this time that we get to read your word and to study. Be with us, sanctify us, help us to conform to your word, help us to apply it to our hearts. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. The first thing you'll notice, like we said, is that in chapter 10, Jesus is in the midst of a conversation with the Pharisees that he began. He began it really in chapter 8. Some have said that this chapter records a talk that Jesus gave on another occasion, but the chapter really doesn't reflect the way that John typically starts a new subject. John, when he starts, the Apostle John, when he's the writer, when he's writing, he will usually set the stage or create a setting, tell you what Jesus is doing, and then go into the teaching of Jesus. You could see it just a few verses down in chapter 10, 6 and 7. Even further. Yeah, verses 22 and 23. And when it was at Jerusalem, the feast of the dedication, and it was winter, and Jesus walked into the temple, into Solomon's porch. So you see, John is setting the stage, setting a context in which the new subject is going to be discussed. In John chapter 10, he doesn't do that. So that the natural context tells us that this is a continuation of what he was telling the Pharisees at the end of John chapter 9. And as a side note, I have here that the chapter and verse structure in the Bible, when John was writing the Bible, he didn't say John 10, verse 1, verily, verily, I say unto you. It was just a text. And somewhere around the year of 1550, a guy named Stephanus, when he was translating it into Greek, he decided to put the verses and the chapter structures in there for the benefit of the reader. And it does help. But sometimes we can get a little bit stringent on the chapter breaks and stuff like that. I say all that to say that just because the chapter stops and another one begins does not mean the text or the context of the subject that Jesus is talking about stops and reorganizes itself. So Jesus is in the midst of a conversation with the Pharisees. This is not something we need to really gloss over before we get to John 10 because Jesus had some rather intense conversations with the Pharisees in recent days. Now, remember, he's about 3 or 4 months away from his death. He is getting close to the death, burial, and resurrection, and he has begun this phase in his ministry where he's allowing his disciples to really ask more questions, and he's giving them much fuller answers, and he's really trying to prepare them better for his departure. In John chapter 8, if you don't have to turn there, but it begins with the Pharisees. Remember, Jesus is in the temple. It begins with the Pharisees dragging the adulterous woman before him in an attempt to trap him and to accuse him. Jesus responds by famously saying that he that is without sin among you, let him first cast a stone at her. And then the scribes and the Pharisees who were trying to trap him, the Bible says that they were convicted and they walked away. Almost immediately after that, Jesus initiates another conversation with the Pharisees in John chapter 8, verse 12. And here he explains to the Pharisees 3 main things. That one, that he was the light of the world. That he, too, was sent and testified of the Father. And additionally, he informed the Pharisees. Now remember, they were the religious experts of Israel at this time. He informed them that they were going to die in their sin because they won't believe what he is saying, that they won't believe in him, and they yet remain in the world. Okay, Jesus is not making friends with the Pharisees. He's clearly condemning them in front of the Jews. Now, we really do need to understand this gravity, because he was saying that these religious leaders of God's people were going to die in their sins and essentially not enter the rest of the Father. Jesus continues in John 8:31, where he tells the Jews that he had come to set them free from the slavery of sin. And they were immediately offended, and they kind of conjured up myths about their own history. Like, we're the people of Abraham. Have we been enslaved? Forgetting their own past. And Jesus, he's talking about the slavery of sin, and they started avoiding the subject and really started claiming their heritage, being sons of Abraham, sons of God. We are sons of God. And this is where another famous Jesus saying comes from. If God were your Father, ye would love me. For I proceeded forth and came from God, neither I came of myself, but he that sent me. John 8:42. Jesus says, no, you are not the true children of God. In fact, he goes one step farther and he says, ye are of your father the devil. Again, not making friends with the Jews and the Pharisees who were likely sitting there. Jesus concludes that he that is of God heareth God's word. Ye therefore hear them not, because ye are not of God. You are telling the religious leaders of Israel that they are not really leading Israel because they are not of God. The chapter concludes with one of my favorite statements of Jesus. He says, verily, verily, I say unto you, before Abraham was, I am. Now that was really the straw, as the saying goes, that broke the camel's back. Jesus told them that they were sinners. He broke up a plot that they had to trap him. He called them sons of the devil. But here Jesus takes the very name of God for himself. What did the Jews do? They took up stones to cast at him. The Jews were going to stone Jesus to death, but Jesus hid himself and left the temple and soon passed by. And this is where chapter 9 begins. As Jesus passed by, he saw the blind man from birth, the blind from his birth. Now, our purpose is not really to exegete John 9, but the chapter directly leads into the text. Notice that it was Jesus' disciples that demonstrate a lack of understanding. And they were asking, is it this man's sin, or is it the sin of the man's parents that was responsible for the man's blindness? You see, this is demonstrate what Jesus is going to point out at the end of chapter 9 and beginning of chapter 10, is that the Pharisees, the religious teachers of the day, they have not been teaching sound doctrine. Okay, they've been teaching the rabbinic law that had developed over thousands of years. The Pharisees, we would all admit that this man's blindness has a direct link to sin, in the sense that all sin, death, and disease and all that is a product of the fall of man. But what the Jews were saying, what the rabbinic teaching was that the sin of the individual or the sin of a parent could directly cause a curse to be placed on you, a curse of blindness in this case. And so here the disciples were echoing the teaching of the modern day rabbis. One commentator notes the rabbis were convinced that the sins of the parents were visited upon the children. They got this from Exodus 20, which says, I, the Lord thy God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children unto the third and fourth generation of them that hate me. Now, thousands of years later from Exodus, this has been interpreted into, if your great-grandfather once sinned and God felt like it, he could place a curse that's going to follow the generations down through. And Jesus really rebukes this idea. He does it really clearly in Luke chapter 13 when he's talking about the tower falling on certain Jews and them dying. And they ask, are these sinners more than others? He said no. Exodus text really suggests that the sin of one generation will have lasting effects on future generations. You know, for instance, if you had a bunch of money and you blunder it, your future generations are going to struggle because of your terrible decision-making and money. That's kind of the idea. One generation falling away from God is going to have lasting effects. It does not mean that an individual's sin results in a curse being laid on that person's family line. And that was what the rabbinic teaching was saying. Ezekiel kind of clears this up in chapter 18. The person who sins will die. The son will not bear the punishment for the father's iniquity, nor will the father bear the punishment for the son's iniquity. The righteous of the righteous will be on him, and the wickedness of the wicked will be on him. Now, why are we talking about this? Well, we're talking about this because we're showing that the Pharisees are not sound teachers. Jesus will later point out that they are blind. He will say that you are false shepherds because you cannot lead my people. The notion that a curse could be passed down through individual sin, Jesus corrects it. He says, neither hath this man sinned, nor his parents, but that the works of God should be made manifest in him. Jesus is basically saying that the purpose of this man's blindness is to reveal the miraculous power of God through the Son of God to substantiate the claims that he was making to be the Messiah, as well as the claims that he already made of being God himself. So this man's blindness was so that Jesus could substantiate his claims of being the Son of God. Jesus then proceeds to heal the man's blindness by applying mud into the eyes. Remember, he picked up the clay, formed it into some mud, put it in the eyes, and had them washed in a pool of Siloam. Now, Jesus here, again, directly violates the rabbinic teaching on the Sabbath. We know that because in verse 16 of chapter 9, the Pharisees kind of flip out, and they're saying, this man is not of God because he keepeth not the Sabbath day. Again, this is generations of poor teachers that are leading Israel that have kind of formulated this rabbinic teaching. Jesus here broke really two laws. He broke one, according to the rabbinic law, you were not allowed to heal someone or make someone better, because doing so would be violating the not working rule of the Sabbath. In a sense, you could keep someone from dying because that was a greater sin than breaking the law of the Sabbath, but you were not allowed to give them ointments or ailments or anything like this that might make them feel better, because that would be working on the Sabbath. The second thing that Jesus broke was that he disturbed the dust of the ground when he took the clay and rubbed it into the man's eyes. Okay, so they were farmers. They did a lot of farming in Israel's day. Farming was working. Therefore, what constitutes farming? Well, it's when you till up the ground. How far do they take that? Well, you shouldn't disturb the ground at all. That's why they got really upset when Jesus is digging around in the dirt on the Sabbath day to heal this man's eyes. Now, just to get you the idea, additional rabbinic law said that you couldn't light a lamp on the Sabbath day because it constitutes work. You couldn't fill your lamp up full of oil to replenish it because that also constitutes work. You couldn't light the lamp and you couldn't extinguish the lamp. So if you had it running on the Sabbath day, you just got to sit there. You couldn't cut your nails. You couldn't wear shoes that had been fixed with nails because that added weight to your shoes, so that when you lifted your foot, you're adding extra work to yourself. You couldn't trim your beard. You couldn't cut your fingernails, etc., etc. See, we're talking about how Jesus is pointing out through his actions how the rabbinic laws have completely missed the point of the original intent of God's law. And it is these Pharisees that Jesus says will be directly accused of false shepherds of Israel in John chapter 10. Jesus referred to these Pharisees as blind guides. Imagine a blind guide not being very good at guiding. He called them fools. He called them whitewashed tombs. He called them serpents and vipers. And worst of all, probably he called them hypocrites. People who would say and teach something but do the opposite. Jesus accuses the Pharisees of being false shepherds over Israel, absolutely incapable of knowing the truth of God, hypocritical in their practice, and really preying off the people who they were supposed to be leading. And if you remember last week in Ezekiel 34, this is exactly what God said was going to happen with these under-shepherds, that they're going to raise up some under-shepherds that are going to feed off the people. So chapter 9 seems to be yet another altercation between Jesus and the Pharisees, in which he points out that their inability to shepherd God's flock. The neighbors had noticed that the man who was born blind was now seeing. Naturally, they come up to him and say, "How are you now seeing? You were blind, but now you're seeing. How is this happening?" The blind man says, "A man that is called Jesus made clay and anointed mine eyes, and he said unto me, Go to the pool of Siloam and wash. And I went and washed, and I received sight." The Jews took him to the Pharisees, who once again asked him to explain the miracle, and he gives them basically the same explanation. Now, do the Pharisees rejoice? Hey, you were once blind, but now you see. It's a great miracle of God. Let's praise God. No. They say, who is this man that is breaking the rabbinic law? They're focused on Jesus, finding any way they can find to destroy him, because he is challenging him all throughout the Gospels. And they come into disagreement because the Pharisees are saying he can't do this because he's a sinner. And other Pharisees are saying, well, wait a minute, if he's really a sinner, how can he heal someone from being blind? And so they ask him again, Mr. Blind Man, who do you think Jesus is? And he says, I think he's a prophet, in verse 17. And the Pharisees, the reaction is really telling. No, that can't be right. That can't be right because, Jesus broke the Sabbath law. So they can't prove that Jesus, they can't disprove Jesus' miracle, and they can't really discredit Jesus because they can't really find fault with him. So the thing they do is set out to disprove that the blind man wasn't really blind. So what do? They call his parents. Now, the parents come into the scene. And the parents, the Bible says, are petrified or afraid of the Jews and of the Pharisees that were in the synagogue, because if they looked like they were appearing to believe and trust in Jesus, they could be thrown out of the synagogue, which in first century in Israel is a pretty big deal. The parents, and God bless them, the parents were really, really afraid. And look at verse 22. They were afraid of being dismissed, and it really shows what kind of shepherds the Pharisees were. I mean, the people, your flock, are afraid of you. That is not a sign of a good shepherd when your sheep are afraid of the shepherd. They don't want to follow them, really. They only have to do what they do to get by. So, because these parents were afraid, they really just kept to the facts. Essentially, they said, yes, this is our son. Yes, he was born blind. Now he sees. Other than that, we don't really know. And in fact, he's of age to be, testifying in court, so just ask him. And that's where we basically started reading. So the Pharisees try to force the blind man from here to condemn Jesus or to put down Jesus. The blind man then gives really a superb defense of Jesus, which we read in John chapter 9. The Pharisees essentially were livid. Again, they were reflecting their spiritual condition and the type of leaders that they were. They accused the blind man of being born a sinner. Remember back when the teaching that Jesus was correcting the disciples of? That's what they're accusing him of now. Because you were born blind, you were a sinner. You were born under this curse. Why are you trying to teach us? Because we are the religious ones. We are the knowledgeable ones. And so they kick him out of the synagogue. Now the best part of this passage is at the end. Jesus heard that the man that was born blind had been kicked out of the synagogue. Went and found him. Jesus went and found the blind man. And he said to the blind man, "Dost thou believe on the Son of God?" And the blind man responds, "Who is he, Lord, that I might believe on him?" And Jesus replies, "It is he that talketh with thee." Now immediately the man born blind believed and fell and worshiped Jesus. Now keep in mind, verse 40, it tells us that the Pharisees were here and they were listening to this conversation going on. Now what are they hearing? They're hearing Jesus say, "I am the Son of God." And they are seeing this man they just kicked out of the synagogue for being a sinner, worshiping Jesus, the one who they're trying to condemn. And then Jesus says some really interesting words. "For judgment I am come into this world, that they which see not might see, and that they which see might be made blind." Jesus is using a physical miracle of the blind man to demonstrate the spiritual need of all men. Jesus was noting that he was coming to give spiritual sight to the blind, and to the blind, the seeing. What does he mean? Well, the word judgment here is a little nuanced. It's not so much a punishment as it is a decision. Okay? So Jesus is saying, I am coming here to declare the condition of men, to show them their duty and danger. My coming will have this effect that when I come in and point out the things that are right and the things that are wrong, some will be saved and some will be more deeply condemned. Essentially, Jesus is coming to declare truth, and as a result, some would be saved and some would be more lost. And it was here that the Pharisees ask, "Are we blind also?" Now their question has a sense of arrogance in it. Are you saying we are blind? Note they reflect the exact mentality that Jesus just said would lead to further blindness. Their question is one of shock, of unbelief, of offense, and essentially they are just livid again. Are you calling us blind? The blind in Jesus' statement refers to those who are spiritually blind due to ignorance, but who desire to see, who desire to be saved. Jesus says, "I'm coming to give them sight so that they may discern truth and salvation." Those which see are those who think they see, those who are proud, who are self-confident, who trust in themselves. They are despisers of the truth that Jesus reveals. Such were the Pharisees, and by their own admission. One commentator notes that this will always be the effect of truth, where it does not soften the hardness of the heart, where it does not convert, it sinks deeper into blindness and condemnation. Jesus concludes by really replying in a very blunt way, "If ye were blind, ye should have no sin," meaning you would not remain under the guilt of your sin because you would have responded to my teaching as this blind man has. But now ye say, "We see," meaning you rest in your self-confidence and are not repentant and hearken unto my teaching. And he says, "Thereof your sin remaineth," meaning you still stand to be judged for your sin. Jesus here is clearly making a distinction between the spiritually blind and the spiritually seeing, as represented by the blind man who was the spiritually seeing and the Pharisees who were the spiritually blind. And now it continues in chapter 10, where Jesus continues this spiritually seeing, spiritually blind, into a discussion of true sheep and of false sheep. The true sheep of God hear the voice of the good shepherd, which is Jesus. The false sheep are not of God because they listen not to the voice of the true good shepherd. But this is the sheep-shepherd metaphor that Jesus is leading into. He's doing it by giving you an example of the spiritually seeing and the spiritually blind. It is the spiritually blind, the Pharisees, who Jesus will say, "You are not my sheep because you're not listening to my voice. The sheep hear my voice." So just like last week at the end of the session, we said the question is, are we the sheep of God's flock, or are we the foreign goats, the false sheep? The question still remains with us today. Are we the sheep of God, or do we not belong to his flock? Let's pray.